Tonight, guys, we are going to hear Jen Souls talk about invasive plants and trees. And she's a natural resources specialist with Arlington County. Although she spends a lot of her time working to control invasive plants, Jen also works at the county's native plant nursery, so she understands both the native plant and invasive plant worlds. Prior to becoming a natural resources specialist, she was a naturalist at Arlington's Gulf Branch Nature Center. All yours, Jen.
All right, thanks. So I'm going to jump pretty much into my presentation. I can't see you when I have the presentation up. So go ahead and turn on your audio and be like, hey, Jennifer, I have a question. I will try to pause periodically for questions, but I won't be able to necessarily notice you raising your hand or anything like that. So there should be plenty of time for questions. So just if you need a couple questions, speak up. Before I really get started in this, how many of you guys already feel like you're familiar with some, like, I don't know if this has come up in previous classes or you knew about it before you started, but if you could just yes, no, either thumbs up, thumbs down, or in the chat or something like that, or you feel like you kind of know what an invasive plant is and could identify one of them at least. And how many think you could like identify 5 or 6 of them? There's still a couple of people saying, yeah, okay. So some of this may be review. So there's always more invasive species. I just recently, there are new species emerging as threats because we keep moving plants around the world and finding out that something is not a good idea in an environment. Some stuff is like sleeper species, and then they start popping out everywhere. So didn't originally assess it as a threat. And then the other thing with invasives is, like I said, we just move them around. I just updated our county invasive species list. And when I did that, I looked at several hundred plants. And a lot of them, like, I'd never even heard of. I was like, I've never even heard of this plant. I don't even, is it in the water? I don't even know, And but a lot of those species are pretty uncommon, fortunately, for us. So there's 10 or 20 that are everywhere, and then there's another couple hundred that are around making their little contribution, I guess you could say. So let me share my screen. um, Share screen. It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Huh, I made you a co-host immediately, but somehow you were unmade and now you're remade.
Okay, I will try again here. There we go.
Apologies, Jen. Don't know what happened.
No worries. So it says I am screen sharing. Can you see this?
Yep.
Yes.
That's good.
All right.
Yes.
So there's my favorite Six Semper Ilanthus, the state logo, right? So I guess is this black bar showing up at the top of all of you as well? No, that must be my thing. Okay.
The one with the pictures does show up.
Okay.
But it's okay. There's enough room to see what you have.
Okay.
What you're sharing.
So basically, not all plants are sort of the same for us in terms of how we look at the environment and how they interact with other plants. There are plants that are native. I'm sure you guys have talked about native trees. There are plants that are not native, but might be valuable to us. They might be valuable for cultural reasons, aesthetic reasons. There might be apple trees or tulips or something that are giving us something of value and not being problematic generally. And then we have invasive plants, which are plants that are not native and are generally causing some sort of economic or ecological harm. So this helps us sort of think about things that might be native and aggressive. Pokeweed shows up everywhere. Wood aster can spread quickly in your garden, but just because something is an aggressive species, if it's native, it's not invasive. And then, of course, So I'm just going to kind of, here's my quick visual definition of invasive species. This is somebody standing among the kudzu. And so I just want to sort of, again, there are what we call weeds, and that can be a plant that's just in the wrong place for us. For me, I tend to think of weeds as something that's showing up more in our cultural landscape, in our gardens, and our lawns, and it's just sort of something we need to manage there in that cultural landscape. For me, an invasive plant is something that is leaving that cultural landscape and going into the natural landscape. So it's going into the forested areas of the parks, going into meadows, changing something that's happening there. I think also invasive plants in terms of economic harm. One of the plants I'm dealing with that's spreading rapidly in Arlington, I was just talking to somebody, they were saying one of the farmers, they know they're from more rural Virginia, that it's impacting their cattle, that it's the grass taking over in their pasture and the cattle can't eat it. So again, something that's moving into more slightly less managed environment and causing a problem. And then the next sort of level up for invasive plants is being declared a noxious weed. And if something is declared an invasive plant at the state level, there's no regulatory authority tied to that. So, the state of Virginia may say that, clematis is a invasive plant, but you can still buy it, sell it, plant it, do whatever you want with it. In Arlington, if I say, so if it's on, well, not if I say, if we say that Arlington has a list of invasive plants, if you are doing something as part of a county project or on county land, we have decided you're not allowed to plant those plants, but that's a county sort of management decision. The state and the federal government do have plants they classify as noxious weeds, and that's usually something that for Virginia, it's often a plant that's not very common here and that they're really trying to control, and that if it's declared a noxious weed, you are no longer allowed to buy it, sell it, do things like that with it in the state of Virginia. The state can even sometimes come in and require you to eradicate it on your property. So this is somebody with giant hogweed, which has been occasionally found in the state of Virginia. And if it is, there's definitely this, like, that has to be eliminated immediately. So that's kind of how things shake out. Invasive plants are invasive because they have a competitive advantage. They're sort of not playing on a level playing. The playing field, I would say, is already being tilted by climate change. The playing field is being tilted by disturbance, and creating all these gaps and edges and things like that. And then invasive plants have a competitive advantage on that field anyway. A lot of times, let's see if I've got a better, what kind of wanna see if I'll stay back here. So it might be something like garlic mustard, which is a plant that releases a chemical from its root system, sort of like walnut, that suppresses the growth of seedlings, suppresses seedling germination. So if you have a lot of garlic mustard in your forest floor, that's this plant here with the little white flowers, it will suppress the growth of other plants and prevent them from germinating. So your next generation of the forest floor isn't really able to come up. Sometimes invasive plants will green up. They get their leaves sooner in the year, and then they will often sometimes stay green longer. So usually around here in March, early April, if you look out in the woods and something is like that spring green in March, that's ahead of all our native species. So it's for me, it's like, oh, what's going on in there? That's a sign that that's probably a non-native species. So they can start getting that sunlight sooner and absorbing it and get that sort of extra boost. A lot of times invasive plants will put a lot of energy into growth, and they also put a lot of energy into seed production, and so they're not putting as much energy into like being deep rooted, having as heavy or solid a wood if it's a tree. Like tree of heaven's really barely brittle. It's like it just sort of falls apart. And so again, they're putting their energy into like covering new ground, taking over, and not into really holding and building carbon stores where they are. Um, so the, to just sort of cover the basics here, and I don't know if you got some of this in your native plant classes. Did you guys have a session on native trees and native plants? Or was that just sort of peripheral?
We don't have
We-
anything specific on native plants, but yeah, we do cover native trees.
Okay. So when you're talking about that, you probably hear the reason why native trees are better for as a player in the system.
Uh,
And
Hey, Jen,
uh-huh.
it's Noreen. I was just going to say, Alonzo did a session for us about trees and the wildlife that depend on them. So there was a little bit of exposure there with native trees, but wouldn't hurt if you repeated a little bit.
Yeah. So, you know, trees are good generally. There are a few trees I would rather not have around here, but most trees are good. And they're doing things like they're sequestering carbon, they're creating oxygen, their roots are holding the soil in place, they're modifying climate, creating shade, all these things. A native plant is also, in addition to all the things that trees do, it's also, for me, as a, like from the ecological point of view, it's putting energy up the food chain. The leaves of that plant are going to be eaten by the bugs that have learned to eat that plant. Every plant produces chemicals in its body to try to reduce its palatability. That's why we don't walk around in the forest munching on plants generally. They usually have like, whether they've got tannins or cyanide or, you know, something in their chemistry to try to reduce how many things eat them. They're not all like soft little lettuces out there. So but there's a lot of insects and other plant species that evolved to eat those native things over generations and generations. And so they're able to be eaten by the native insects, and then that passes energy up the food chain to everything that eats the insects, whether it's a frog or a bat or a bird or anything else. So the invasive plants haven't really, they're not part of that network, and so they're not eaten as much as the native species. And so they have less control on them. There's less herbivory on them. In addition to all these other competitive advantages they may have. And so then they're spreading out through the systems, and then they're kind of taking over those spaces and reducing the ability of those spaces to provide for all the wildlife that would be in those places. So I'm not going to go too into this, but it definitely is something that for, you know, as tree stewards, I think when I look at the woods of Arlington, I want to make sure those woods are regenerating, because we have, you know, we're always concerned about the tree canopy and all the benefits, again, that trees bring. And so while we do plant along streets, we plant in our backyards, we plant in front of our community centers, we also have a lot of trees in our forests, you know, and we have about 550 acres of forest in Arlington, which isn't very much, but it's what we have. And I need to make sure that that forest is healthy and is regenerating, and we're getting that next, when a tree falls over in the woods, we shouldn't have to go in there and plant. It should be able to come back after disturbance. And when you get the invasive pressure in there, when you get a gap in the, like this is obviously a huge pile of kudzu, but when you get that gap in the woods, the invasives tend to come in and take over in that gap, and then the tree regeneration doesn't happen. We also got to manage deer, but that's another topic I won't get into here. And so once you've shifted over to this invaded area, it's very hard for the natural tree regeneration to occur. You just sort of get stuck with this sort of vines on top of bushes, and then the bushes eventually lose, I think. So again, for the invasive plants and trees, invasive vines are the easiest one to see. Oh, that is impacting a tree. I can see that it is strangling a little tree sapling as it's growing up. It can even strangle mature trees. I've seen wisteria wrap around trees and just like it's like they're trying, they can grow through a chain link fence. Trees are amazing, but it is this like tight collar pressure, like strangling the tree. And then even if they're not like stranglers, like wisteria, they can just the weight of that plant on the tree and that just all that vegetation, all the leaves and all the vine on the tree, it sort of holds moisture against the bark, which makes the tree more vulnerable to diseases and fungal issues. Just the weight of it on the tree can be hard. I think, again, some of these vines are like under tension. I've cut wisteria vines and it's sort of like popped out where they're pulling on the tree. They're literally pulling on the tree all the time. So again, I think it's easy to see what the vines do to trees, but our invasive. And so as tree stewards, if all you do is get vines off trees or encourage other people to vines off trees, that's great. That's our number one thing. When we go into an area, first thing we do is like, okay, let's get the vines off the trees and then we'll deal with everything else. But the other invasive species that we manage do also impact trees. So they can smother the seedlings, they can release chemicals that suppress the germination. That's not just the bushes, but also herbaceous species. And then just sort of like monopolizing all the resources and taking up that space is another thing they can do.
Hey, Jen.
Uh-huh.
Could you just, there are a couple of vines that are not bad, like Virginia creeper. Could you just kind of mention not all vines kill the tree?
Yes. So yes, not all vines are bad. We definitely have native vines that are around here. Virginia creeper, leaves of 5, let it thrive is, if you're familiar with poison ivy, in fact, is a native vine that, leaves of 3, let it be, or so we do have some native vines that usually they don't have as heavy, they're maybe not evergreen for the Virginia creeper and the poison ivy. The vines don't get so big on the tree. They're not stranglers generally. What is another? The grape. Sometimes the native grapes can be an issue if you have like, you're doing forestry and you've got like a young tree plantation and the grape gets in there. It can be very heavy and take the trees down, but normally we found that the grape is sort of light enough of a presence and it's not nearly as aggressive. It will cover maybe that one tree lightly, maybe 2 or 3 trees lightly. But generally the native grape doesn't seem to be too bad. It's not going to do what porcelainberry does, where it's just going to totally smother everything. And then it's providing the leaves are food for the native species, the fruit is food for the native species. So it's doing a good job there out in the system. But yeah, I would say like you want to identify your vines before you manage them, certainly for all invasive species. If you don't know what it is, just leave it alone.
Jennifer, I have a question. Do you have any idea why something like wisteria would evolve to basically kill its host? Wouldn't that also ultimately kill it? I don't get it.
What happens? And there is, I should say, there is a native wisteria as well, which actually I bought at the garden center and planted in my backyard. But again, it's not as aggressive as the non-native wisteria. So why a vine would do this? You would think that once it gets up in the tree and sort of, a lot of times that structure, that tree will remain dead underneath the plants for quite a while, still providing that sort of like thing you see in this picture. And then also, a lot of these can also just be like covering the ground. So sometimes they're going to go up, they're going to reproduce, but they can also just be there covering the ground. They don't have to be up in a tree to live. So they don't need the trees. A lot of times they'll, like English ivy reproduces once it's up in a tree, but it's also totally happy just to cover the forest floor too, or, cover part of your yard if that's what you're using it for. Does that make sense? Okay. So I was saying like invasives have a competitive advantage, and around here they're really thriving. We don't generally see invasives if you have a really good big intact chunk of forest. You might have some invasives in it, but I've seen pictures where one side of the trail, that area had been logged or farmed or something. And another side of the trail, that area had never been disturbed. and it might just look like a path through the woods, but one side has a lot more invasives. It's that side that experienced disturbance. So they are sometimes like more, they are symptomatic a lot of times of that kind of disturbance of edges. They are plants that are adapted to be that early successional species, and they're finding this kind of broken up, fragmented area. They also there's a lot of research on how invasive plants interact with climate change and how their ranges shift and how their behavior changes. If you go to Florida, Florida's like the epicenter of half the invasives on the East Coast. And, there, a lot of them are only held down south by the climate. And so it's definitely, we're looking at what we can expect to see shift around. Because invasives are often very prolific seed producers, and they're trying to go into those edge areas, those disturbed areas. Their seeds are very good at moving, and so we'll see them spread faster with climate change than the natives spread on their own. I mean, there are certainly natives that move around in disturbed areas, but invasives are particularly good at that. So these plants were introduced for a variety of reasons. They didn't just decide to like, I'm going to invade this part of Virginia or something. They were brought here. We brought them here primarily, often on purpose. We brought them here because they looked pretty, because they were fast growers, because they had something we valued. I've seen ads for porcelainberry. It was like in a magazine in the 60s. They're like, oh, get this plant. It'll cover your porch in just one summer and provide shade and that sort of thing. And it has these really attractive berries. So some of these were deliberately introduced. Sometimes they're introduced for erosion control, for wildlife food. I myself, in my 20s, the state of Virginia was encouraging us to plant autumn olive as a wildlife food, this invasive shrub. Now we know it's an invasive shrub. At the time, they're just like, hey, it has a lot of berries. The birds eat them. So sometimes they're just brought in by accident, might be packing material, might be like the seeds are just in the soil or something, or brought along by accident, but quite often they're intentional. Garlic mustard was brought over as a food plant, by the Europeans in the 1700s. So one thing for me, I would really just getting the word out that if you wouldn't dump it in your neighbor's yard, please don't dump it in a park. It may be organic material, it may be leaves, it may be branches. You may have only natives in your yard and it may be fine, but just generally, if you wouldn't dump it in your neighbor's yard, you wouldn't put this over the fence, into your friend's house, please don't dump it in a park. I definitely have seen species pop up, and I find some like landscaping debris, and I'm like, oh, this is where this came from. So that's one way they're sort of still moving around in Arlington. And then they just grow once they're here, so they just spread out. So I think people were giving me I sort of asked this at the beginning. I have invasive plants in my own yard. I inherited the yard I have. I'm gradually trying to get them, like, to keep pulling English ivy off the big oak tree in my front yard, so it doesn't get too heavy on it. It's just little tendrils keep coming up. So we all have these plants around, and they're very common in what we see in the parks and in our yards outside our apartment buildings. So I'm not gonna ask you to
do a question, Ms. Souls. This is Tara Ronzetti. So I have a waterfall of English ivy coming into my yard from my neighbor's yard. And all I do is I keep cutting it back at the fence and cutting it back at the fence. Is there an etiquette? What does one do there? You know what I mean? It's because it's really annoying. They just have let it go out of control. And then and funny enough, I did blow my leaves this spring, and that same neighbor was like, it's really better to leave the leaves. Like,
And then there it's, you know, for
yeah,
people,
dude, I know that. Okay. Why don't you deal with your
like,
English ivy?
yeah, that said, like I mulch I mow some of my leaves into my yard. I just have too many leaves. I couldn't, you know, they would smother
Right,
everything.
right. But I'm
Um,
just saying it was
yeah.
ironic. So
So-
how does one deal with that when it's like just literally it's a waterfall of English ivy coming from the neighbor?
Yeah. So I think this is something, you know, everybody who's gardening to sometimes deals with is like what your neighbor has. I mean, plants grow and they spread and they move, they don't respect property lines. I'll just say right off, there's no real legal recourse for anything at this point. Arlington will be considering a bamboo ordinance as I update the invasive. We work to update the invasive plant strategy, but that's nothing that's going to be solving your problem. And you know, I would say,
Oh,
oh,
I also inherited like a bamboo, I feel like a bamboo field in our backyard too.
yeah,
Trying to feel that.
yeah. That's one of the issues with like putting in a bamboo ordinance is we have a lot of inherited plants that we didn't plant. So it's not like, oh, it's your fault versus my fault. It's just we all have these plants now. So I would say, you know, the first thing is just like if you build a good relationship, like, hey, hi, when you see them. And so it's not just, you know, if you can build a relationship with your neighbor, which is always good to do, have conversations, you know, be receptive when they talk about leaf blowing, things like that. And just be like, hey, I'm working to at some point be like, oh, I've been spending a lot of time doing this. Do you think you could pull it back a foot on your side? And you
Okay,
just
I
sort
see
of,
what you're saying.
you know, you're not asking them to remove all the ivy from their yard. You're just saying, hey, could you just like sort of weed whack the fence line on your side or something like that, just to, there'll be still strays that come across, but at least if they can do a little bit on their side. So, you know, make it a smaller ask.
Right,
If
right.
you can. Um,
Because it's a heavy lift for me to try to control it.
yeah.
Okay,
And
thank you. I'll try that.
so you might just be like, oh, can you just right along the edge? You know, once or twice a year, can you just come and, you know, and I'll give you some banana bread or something like that, you know,
Right,
right,
right.
you know, with
Thank
dry
you.
bribing. Yeah. And you might ask other tree stewards, you know, as you move forward with this, oh, have you had experience? What worked for you? Yeah, so one thing we are doing is we are trying to educate people about this problem. Speaking of that, if the ivy is going up their trees in their yard, it's sort of a different issue than if it's just on the ground. But the choking hazard, you did all receive that.
Mhm.
Ivy is sort of like an introductory invasive species in a lot of way. It's one that it's very easy to identify. It's you know, evergreen, particularly it's a vine climbing tree. So that's a lot of times if people know about an invasive, often that's one of the few they know about. If it's not like murder hornets or spotted lanternfly or something, you know, a little more exciting.
Miss Soul, sorry again. Can we get that to put in our yard? That sign that says choking hazard, ivy is a threat to.
It is not. It's just like 8 inches by 8 inches. It's not a yard sign.
Oh, that's a
So,
really cool little thing though. Okay.
and then the other side has like how to take ivy off the trees and stuff like that. And this was actually a really nice project that was sort of, I can't remember if it was the Tree Stewards or Master Naturalists. I think it was a joint effort where they did some market research and they're like, we are not our audience. If we go on and on about how this is terrible for the trees or the ecology or something, that's one thing. But they're like, hey, this is going to affect your property value. let's speak to our wider audience. This is, you know, going to negatively impact, you know, how my home is. So that does exist. You could probably laminate it and stick it on a sign in your yard, I suppose. There's more signage about natives and leaving leaves and stuff like that that's available these days. You know, volunteering is obviously something that people can do. We have about 15 volunteer events a month that happen in Arlington. There are more volunteer events happening in Alexandria because I know some of you are Alexandria people. And then that the TreeStewards organize there. And then there's probably another 5 or 6 events that happen, 7, 8, 9 events that happen quarterly or less frequently. I would say if you get into this, it can be very satisfying. You can eventually get a job working for the county as the invasive coordinator. Yeah, but not everybody likes doing this all the time. But I do encourage you to go out a few times at different times of the year. Like try going to one in the summer, one in the winter, one in the fall, one in the spring, going to different parks, just sort of getting a sense of what different people are doing, after you spend 2 hours pulling a plant, you will know what that plant is. You will be able to recognize it in other places and just feel more aware of the plant. And several of our people leading these are tree stewards. They're not all master naturalists. Some of them are both. We have a lot of, triple crown and double crown people out there. But, it's a good way to just sort of connect with other people who are interested in these issues. And then the other thing people can do is just sort of prevent new infestations. Don't bring new things in. And that's sort of a plant this, not that is a new resource that's out there. The master gardeners have a lot of plant this, not that information. If you choose a native plant, you don't have to do as much research on it. One thing I would say is if you're thinking about buying a vine or a ground cover, just try typing the name of that plant in and then the word invasive and just Google sweet autumn clematis invasive and just see if you get your screen fills with hits on that topic. And if it doesn't, then you might have a pretty good chance. For me, it's like the ground covers, the vines, and then some, and the non-native grasses generally are the most problematic things out there that I want people to be a little more cautious about when they buy them at the store and plant them. And then we are doing a periodic early detection rapid response. That's again where we're looking at a species that might just be moving into the area or just becoming a problem. Sometimes it's just like, hey, everybody be aware of this one thing. If you find it, let me know. Sometimes we're working and going out and sweeping a park looking for a particular species to try to get it under control before it becomes something like English ivy, which is in every park in the county. So as tree stewards, you guys are kind of one of the people are going to look for and look to when you're just having a conversation. Once your neighbors know you're a tree steward, your friends know you're a tree steward, they're going to ask you questions about trees. They're going to ask you, what about this dead branch in my tree? They're going to ask you, what kind of tree should I plant? They're going to come to you with tree things, and just being aware that this is something else you can bring to the table, like being aware that ivy is an issue for trees, that these vines, like, oh, what a beautiful tree you have in your yard. It will probably last longer if you do this. And just as these kind of conversations come up, encouraging other people to make the right choices and take better care of their trees and the environment. What was I gonna? There was some other. I was just gonna say, when I worked as a naturalist, like one of the things people will bring you is scat, which is animal poop, and you just like, you're like, oh, you're seen as this authority, an educator, like, here, I have this, what is this? So you will get like those kinds of why is my tree turning brown, questions. So just learning as much as you can about all the issues that impact them is really, really good. One of the things for me as a tree steward and being an educator and one of those people getting the word out is that for invasive species, we have what we call the invasive species curve. And generally, as a species is first showing up, people don't recognize it as a problem right away, unless it's been known as a problem someplace else. And then you get a few, first they sleep and then they creep, you get a few of them around. And if you can do this early awareness of what these invasives are, it's much easier to manage them when they're still low on the invasive curve, that population hasn't started leaping forward. And at this point, it may actually be possible to eradicate the species and prevent it from becoming established. For us, usually what happens is the public may become aware that there's a problem somewhere up here, at which point you're never going to eradicate it. or eradication require a ton of effort and intervention, and we just wouldn't have the resources. So what we're always trying to do is move this general awareness down here while we still have a chance of getting rid of the species. So, or preventing it from becoming a thing. There's, well, what's gonna say, we have in Arlington this species that looks a lot like Virginia creeper, which has 5 leaves, and it's called bush killer. And it's only found in one park in one location, and we keep hammering at it because we're really trying to eradicate it there. I think there's one other place in Virginia it's occasionally found. So we're just trying to prevent that. It's called bush killer for a reason. It's this really aggressive vine that'll smother trees and bushes. And so if we could just stop it before it spreads out of that park, everything will be so much better. So just trying to kind of make yourself aware of what are some of these things that are coming, what could be the long-term impact of them.
Miss Souls, I'm sorry. This is just this is Tara again. This is one of my passionate subjects. I have a question real quick because I have this awesome other neighbor who is a master gardener as well, and he's been trying to get rid of all the honeysuckle. And I just realized he got rid of this massive tree it was like a tree. It was so huge. But I realized he put it out on the street for Arlington to pick up. What now, if we get rid of a big invasive something, can we have Arlington come pick it up? Are they gonna like chop it up and put it in mulch and then it's gonna be
so yes, I do get that question a lot. I've got to add like some frequently asked questions to my page. If you put it, so Arlington has the green bins, right, which are the compost. If you put things in that green bin, it gets industrially composted. Things are not going to survive that process. If you can throw a pepperoni pizza in that bin, you can throw some plants and plant seeds and plant parts in that bin. If you have stuff in what are they, those like, why can't I think, paper bags, those big heavy duty paper bags, those are also collected by the same people who collect the green bin. The stuff in those brown paper bags that you put at the curb, that also goes to the industrial composting facility. If you put stuff at the curb for a brush pickup,
yeah, that's what I'm wondering about.
That goes to, or if you just rake leaves and they're vacuumed up, that all goes, the brush pickup or the leaf pickup goes to a different, that does not go to the industrial composting site. So though that gets composted lightly is what I would say. So if you have a big bush honeysuckle, if you have stuff and there's no like active propagation, like it is true that like a piece of English ivy, if you cut it and throw it on the forest floor and it rains a fair amount, it may send out roots and re-root. But generally, it's not too like yes, it's possible, but it's not probable. So we generally say if it's something that doesn't have like the seeds or the like little maybe tubers or bulbs or something attached to it, and it goes into that brush pickup, it goes into that leaf pickup, chances are it's not going to be a problem in the future. But if your bush honeysuckle has berries all over it,
right, which is like right now,
it does right now, those berries are going to survive that process.
Okay, thank you for letting me know that.
So I would say that if you're going to just put it up for brush pickup, it's just better to do it. If you wait till December, most of those berries will have fallen off. Then you have until August, pretty much before they ripen up again. So put it to the curb in May, or put it sometime when it's not going to become a thing. That said, usually when people are getting, like a lot of stuff gets just chopped up and thrown into like the wood chip pile. Usually when people are spreading wood chips or spreading leaf mulch that they're getting from the county, it's in some sort of garden setting. And they're going to have to weed that anyway. Like even if there were no plant seeds in that, you put a spread out mulch in your yard, there may or may not be seeds in the mulch. And then like it's a perfect place for plants to grow. That's why we use mulch. And so, they're just going to get stuff sprouting in it as it drifts in, as it blows in, as birds fly by. Same with the wood chip stuff. So it's, it's better not to put it in when it actually has the seeds, or if it has like little tubers or something like that, it's better to put that part into the trash. But on the other hand, if it gets wood chipped and spread somewhere, it's probably not gonna.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we definitely rely on our volunteers to go out and do a lot of this work, cutting the vines off of things. This is Jo over at Brandymore Castle. She's put a lot of just especially the propagules, putting those in trash bags for pickup. I do have, here's my top 10. This is not in order. I would say that, I porcelainberry. I'm leaning towards porcelainberry as my top invasive these days, and then sweet autumn clematis. It's so pretty, but that's such a thing. English ivy, I feel like I can get a hold of. So it's less like what I would call my top invasive, probably changes every couple of months depending on what I'm dealing with. Some of these may be familiar with you. Some of them may be new to you. And I think I have a few pictures of some of them. No, I just have a cartoon about them. So they're all out there. There's some poor trees. The police station. So this is one that I'm going to bring up because this time of year it's very noticeable. Sweet autumn clematis has these white flowers. They have a sweet scent, which is why it's called sweet autumn clematis. This just made it to the state invasive list 2 weeks ago. Woohoo! So that was good news. This is for sale. I see it at Alfred Garden Center that is selling clematis. They'll have a lot of kinds of clematis that are not a problem. And then they'll have this. So, and the thing with this, it's also sometimes been called old man's beard. It has this very fluffy seed head that's become very distinctive again. So you'll see it. It's in bloom right now, and it's also transitioning to the sort of fluffy seed head. There is a native clematis, which has the same leaves, but they're toothy. I don't think you're going to find virgins. You're not going to be, if some clematis pops up in your yard, on your bushes, on your fence, on your trees, I don't want to say it's impossible that it's the native clematis, but I would be astonished if it were. So this is definitely something to keep an eye out for. This time of year, it's very easy. All these plants have a time when they're very easy to identify. So if you don't know them, don't feel like you have to be able to identify them 12 months of the year. The more time you spend on them, the more you're like, oh, there it is, but they'll all have a time when they're very distinctive, and you can just tackle them then, or just be like, oh, now I know what that is. I'll get it. I'll pay attention to it throughout the year, and then you start to know them throughout the year. So this time of year, sweet autumn clematis is definitely very distinctive.
Hey, there was a question in chat. Would you cover how to distinguish between grape and porcelainberry?
Yes, I will. Well, I think there we go. So I'll come back to that one. But bittersweet, round leaf bittersweet. Again, there is a native bittersweet. I don't think we don't have it anymore in Arlington, except there's a few plantings like in people's yards or at the nature center. There's the native bittersweet. But again, it's got this sort of round leaf with this very like little tip on it. Fairly round. And then again, it'll have this very distinctive, not so much right now, but in another month or two, there's places driving along the GW Parkway where there's just sort of this orange haze of vine. Like the leaves have fallen off and the fruit remains, the seeds remain, and it's this sort of like orangey haze on the vines. And so then it becomes very distinctive. And then the bark has these little lenticels, these little dots, kind of like the I think a tree that has that. Cherries have those lines, those lenticels that are lines on the bark. Bittersweet has these dots. Bittersweet can get to be pretty big. I've got a chunk of it here at my desk that's bigger around than my leg. So it can get to be good to be a pretty massive vine eventually. Bittersweet has a nice trick. I didn't show it here, but let me go back up here. The roots of it are orange. So this is bittersweet right here with those orange roots. So if you pulling it, it's usually very shallowly rooted. And when you pull it up, the roots are orange. So then you knew you'd pull the right thing. And if the roots aren't orange, you can just tuck it back in the ground and put the dirt back on top of it and, look over there, everyone. um, so I'm kind of doing a little ID, but this is not the best way to learn these plants. It's just getting out there. And that's, again, why I encourage people to do some occasional volunteering. You'll get to know this plant if you spend all day, or not all day, but if you spend an hour removing this plant, you will know it. Porcelain berry, somebody was asking about porcelain berry and grape. This is, again, I think one of the most common ones in Arlington. The leaves can look very much like native grape leaves. But they can have very different shapes. So, here's a more sort of traditional one. Here's a more lobed leaf. So the leaves themselves can have different shapes on porcelain berry and on grape. So going by the leaf, I know people can do it, but it's definitely a challenge. One thing to do is just wait this time of year. If it's got the berries, they're very distinctive and definitely different. There'll be all these different colors. They will be like a white mush inside them versus our native grapes will be hanging down in little clusters, and there'll be that sort of dark purplish black, and it tastes kind of good if tangy. The other thing with the porcelain berry is even when it's in flower, the fruit of it is kind of held up, whereas the grapes hang down, like they'll hang down below the vine. And so the flowers of the porcelain berry are also up above the vines instead of hanging down into them. And then another way to tell is if you cut the stem of it, the interior of porcelain, like porcelain, your toilet, your china, it's white. And so you'll have that interior white stem. You may have to cut in 2 or 3 different places. It's not going to be where the stem is only the size of a toothpick. It's not going to be big enough to see that inner pith, that white core. But if you're looking for something sort of pinky size, thumb size, usually by that point, you should be seeing that white interior porcelain white thing. The bark is also different. The bark of native grape, which is this over here, you'll get these long strips that peel off of it. And porcelain berry bark holds tighter to the plant. There's a book called Mistaken Identity that I can put in the chat, or maybe Noreen, you can put in the chat. That is just basically a guide to like, here's the native, here's the invasive. And there's a lot of, if you just, again, Google porcelain berry versus grape, there's a lot of resources out there. But if you're not sure, you can make a few cuts, look for that white pith. And then you can also just wait. And if it's porcelain berry, you'll know because the fruit is very different. I also sometimes, once I know there's porcelain berry, a lot of porcelain berry in an area, when it's just a little seedling on the ground nearby, yeah, it's probably porcelain berry. If there's no mature grapevines anywhere nearby, I figure all that little stuff popping up is porcelain berry, if that's where the porcelain berry was. Let's see, what else have I got? I'm not going to go over all the vines, but this is definitely something to sort of start adding to what you know and what you're looking for. But I would say these are the sort of some of the top 3. I'm just going to sort of share this. These are my top 20 invasive plants for sale. Again, just thinking about being aware. The only invasive tree that is for sale these days is Callery pear, the Bradford pear, and its sort of descendants and cousins. And I don't think it's still for sale. I still see it. So just encouraging people not to buy it. The tree also has some structural weaknesses, so it's branching. I don't know if you guys have talked about Callery pear or Bradford pear before. It was designed to be a sort of the perfect street tree and yard tree, and then they found that in addition to being extremely invasive, it has structural weakness because it has a lot of branches coming out from one place, and so it tends to like break off chunks of it, and it wasn't as good an idea as I thought it was. They kind of got it started. So that's, I think, the main one. There is any other trees. Mimosa can be invasive. It's not for sale. Tree of Heaven is not for sale, though I think I've actually seen it for sale online. Or Ailanthus is Tree of Heaven. Ton tree, I don't think you really have to worry about anything. So again, just sort of being aware that these species are out there, encouraging people to kind of take a moment to think about what they're planting and buying before they do it. Several times now, the Virginia legislation has considered a bill that would require places that sell plants to label invasive species as invasive, but that hasn't made it into law yet. So a lot of it's just people mean well and they don't know. I'm gonna skip that. So just a little bit about what we do with this. This is an issue for us because the forested lands that I manage, and like I say, these forests are where a lot of our tree canopy still is, and definitely are cool areas, places of refuge for us, in supporting not just ourselves, but all species, that we're not losing those lands that are currently forested in Arlington to development if it's publicly owned. And so for us, invasive species was that next biggest issue in our woods. We are rolling through. We've got about 350 acres in management right now of the 550 acres, so we're more than halfway. And we're using a variety of ways to manage the program. We've actually, for the last few years, gotten a boost in our funding, so that's exciting. We'll see what happens in the future. So we use biological control. That's a mile a minute weevil, this little guy right here, and making holes in the mile a minute. So we still have mile a minute in Arlington. It is still an annoying, it's also called devil's tear thumb. You can see all these little thorns on it, and there's thorns on the underside of the leaf as well. But it used to go more like 10, 15, 20 feet up, and now it tends to peter out around 5, 10 feet up. So we still have it, but it's not as aggressive due to the introduction of this weevil. Not this year, the year before, we started releasing these little tiny wasps that are parasites on the emerald ash borer. And have you guys talked about like the emerald ash borer?
Yes.
Okay. So I figured at some point that may have come up. There probably was a whole section on diseases and pests and everything like that. So a lot of invasive species that aren't invasive plants, these are, a lot of our invasive pests, are invasive. The emerald ash borer is not a native species. A lot of these things have just totally wiped out whole chunks of trees. Chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease. A lot of these are, you could call them invasive pathogens, invasive insects. So that's definitely an issue that's really impacting, our trees and our forests. So anyway, this, like 2 years ago, we started getting these little tiny wasps that are parasites on the emerald ash borer beetle. And we released them in Barcroft and in Benjamin Banneker last year and this year. So we're hoping that they get established and then they start parasitizing the emerald ash borer and reducing its population and its impact on ash trees, so that ideally in the future we can have more ash trees again in our forest, because we've lost almost all of them. Now, this is the champion ash tree in Arlington County, by the way, that's in Barcroft Park that John is leaning on. And I guess you guys have probably met Vincent at some point.
Yes.
Yes, and
Yeah.
there's Gonzo back there. So there we are. And that's John. He's our boss.
Jennifer, where do you guys get the insects that you're?
So Fairfax County was doing this, and one of our foresters, actually, I was talking to her. She now works for Fairfax. And I was like, where do you get these things, Tina? I had the same question. And how much do they cost? And how complicated is it? And she was like, oh, you just fill out this application online, you know? So I get them from through APHIS, which is the Agricultural Pest Health Inspection Services. I'm gonna get that wrong. Yeah, from the USDA APHIS. And so they have places where they're breeding these wasps, these Ubius wasps. And, you know, we filled out an application. We had to say, hey, these are the 2 parks we're planning to release them. That we are also next year, we're going to start doing collections. We're going to be participating to look and see if we can find any of these or their impact on the ash borer. And, you know, that we're government agency, et cetera. And then they turned out they're free. I was like, why? Yeah, let's get some of these things, you know? So, you know, it's a little bit of staff time to go out and put them in the parks. They come in these little pill bottles, and in the pill bottle is a coffee filter. And on the coffee filter are these little dark specks, which are actually the pupa of the wasp. And so you open the pill bottle, there's a little screen over the end, the wasps are smaller than a grain of rice, and they can go right through that mesh. And they fly out and hopefully find some emerald ash borer to kill. So yeah, it's so we're using biological control. And it's, again, like the pest species, the emerald ash borer has no natural predators here. So trying to get some of those brought back in again. And there's a very rigorous process. I think, you know, if you look at what happened 30, 50 years ago, it may not have been as rigorous, but the process has become very rigorous. They test to make sure that it will only, you know, impact that one species. They try, like, well, what about a native cousin of it, or like a very similar, like a same genus, different species. And they also a lot of times will test these species to see if they will go after just other things that are common, you know, like if we're releasing something that might be a pathogen on Tree of Heaven, we might want to check Tree of Heaven cousins, but they also check stuff like corn and wheat because they just want to make sure that it's not gonna, you know, and oak trees and you know, like the common species, just like kind of check a lot of stuff just to make sure that it's not going to make that leap. We use chemical control, so this is something that I manage contractors that do this work. We try to be as targeted as possible. So they use a blue dye. So if you see blue plants in the woods, don't touch them when they're wet. The dye usually dries within, you know, if it's a hot day in July, it dries within 15 minutes. A misty day in November or January, it might take like an hour or so to dry on. We don't do this when it's raining or going to rain, again, because we want the herbicide to stick to our target. Both because of the environmental impacts and then because, you know, it'd be a total waste of time and energy if you put it out there before rain. And so again, we're like, this is a case where we cut down a non-native cherry tree and then put herbicide on the cut stump. Sometimes we're spraying vegetation. This is a little wavy leaf. You can't tell, but this arrow is pointing to wavy leaf basket grass. We just had 3 plants right there and sprayed those. And then we always try to put up signage, notify the community in advance. And we did, you know, you can try managing invasive plants without herbicide, but it is almost, if you have like your backyard, you can do it. If you have a couple 100 acres, there's no way. So we try to get that work with the volunteers, which is the next slide, to do as much as we can ahead of time, and then to do follow-up work. So that means we have to use less herbicide in the parks if we have volunteers doing follow-up work. And then also it just makes our resources go a long way. And just also, I think, increases awareness as people volunteer. Oh, we have this beautiful park here, I didn't know. And then they realize what some of the impacts to this park are. This is a pretty old picture, actually. Looking at it. So we have the volunteers working with us. Again, if you do choose to do this, we try to work in sites where we're not going to get 100% removal of all invasives, but we're trying to get to that like 90%, you know, removal of invasives so that they're just a few popping up and we just need to kind of keep managing those few that pop up. So we're working in small sites. In some areas, we're just trying to like get a situation under control until I can get in there with professional contractor help. Get the vines off the trees, keep the trees alive and healthy until we can come in there and do another level of work. Some places it's doing sort of this maintenance level, just a sweep of certain things, just to kind of keep the park clean once we've got it clean. And then again, you know, this really like heavy duty grunt work, just stretching the contractor dollars. You know, it takes contractor time to stop and cut bush vines off trees. You know, that's not like walking through the forest, you know, spot spraying. So the more we can stretch our dollars, the better we can. And the neighboring jurisdictions all have similar programs and strategies. As you get involved in tree stewards, you'll occasionally see me reaching out for this is the early detection rapid response. Like, hey, we're going to go and look for incised fumewort. Can you come help? We're going to go out in this one area and look for wavy leaf basket grass. Can you come help? This is autumn fern, which is emerging as an invasive in this area. And this thing down here, I have never seen in my life, but it's called crow dipper, and it's popped up in Fairfax. It's popped up in Montgomery. It's very distinctive plant. So keeping an eye out for those sort of odd new plants to you. If you take a picture of them with iNaturalist, it will be scooped up and reported automatically to me. But you can also just always contact me. Send me a picture or two. So this does work. We've definitely seen this, and we've been doing this in Arlington for almost 20 years now. So there are parks where the forest floor was completely covered in invasives, and it was very heavy on the trees. You know, there's a removal phase, and then you just kind of got to give it some time, assuming the deer browse pressure isn't too high, and you will see that the native plants do regenerate and sort of come back. This is Lubber Run, and there are parts of Lubber Run that's where we first sort of started this work systemically. If you're like at the Lubber Run amphitheater, for those of you in Arlington who may know it, it looks like there's patches of snow on the hill opposite the amphitheater, and that's patches of bloodroot, which is a native spring wildflower that wasn't there. It was all covered with ivy. So we've really seen this sort of slow regeneration, and it's really satisfying to see it, see an area kind of come back and get healthy again. And this is also a park where generally, like if a tree falls over in that park, the forest just kind of heals itself and new trees grow. It doesn't get smothered by vines before that next tree can kind of come in. So that's what we're kind of aiming for.
Hey, Jen, there are a couple more questions in chat.
Yep.
One with regards to the weevil that preys upon the emerald ash borer. How is that weevil controlled?
Oh, so that's actually a wasp. I'm gonna stop sharing. And I can always start sharing again, but so the weevil is on the mile a minute, and it's been here in Arlington for at least 10, 15 years now. And it's pretty much, if you find mile a minute, you'll find those little holes in it. The wasp is controlling the emerald ash borer. And there are like 4 species of wasp that USDA cleared for release, and they just sort of release different ones in different areas depending on, you know, the weather, time of, you know, what they have in production, and also just the region. Some of them do better in different areas. So how is that wasp controlled? Is that the question?
I made the incorrect assumption as to what the weevil was referring to. So it just said, how is the weevil controlled? Full disclosure there.
Yeah, so the weevil is controlled by, because basically it will only eat mile a minute. So we don't actually, just like there are monarchs and milkweeds, like the monarch butterfly, the monarch caterpillar is only going to eat certain species of milkweeds. There's several species of milkweed it might eat, but it's only going to eat those milkweeds. And so, the what is it? The forest emperor moth is only going to eat hackberry. And so it sort of has its own built-in control that it's not going to, you know, they did a lot of testing where they basically like put the thing in like, all right, we're taking away all your mile a minute, you got to eat something else, and they just die. And a lot of insects, like, that's why we're really want to have those native plants, because they will only eat that thing that they have evolved to eat. Evolution happens, sometimes species do make a leap, but our assumption is that there will always be a mile a minute around. It's still certainly here, and as long as that mile a minute is present, the weevil will not make that leap to start eating something else, because it's got that, it evolved with mile a minute, where it originally came from. And they test like hundreds of species, and then they narrow it down to just maybe one or two that are very tight to their target, if that makes sense, and not generalists, but very host specific.
Another question. Do you have a place where you post the invasive removal volunteer needs rather than just emails? Or in addition to?
Invasive removal. Oh, like if you want to see when they are and when they're happening? Yes, as a matter of fact. So there's sort of two places they're posted. I would say that one of them is just one of them is the Master Naturalist calendar, because that's more of a calendar view, quite honestly. And what I have in the county doesn't work as a calendar view at this time. Let me share my screen again. So currently, let's put this on here. We have, like, on the county webpage, which I can just like basically become a volunteer, free register here. And so this will take you to, and we also have the county events, these events listed on the county calendar. But basically that registration will take you to this page. And this is a list of all the places in Arlington where we are doing this work.
Hey, Jen, we can't see your screen if you're.
Oh, I didn't. Let me. Sorry, I took the sharing away. I was saying, for Arlington, at least, if you Google Arlington invasive plants, this is the county page. One day I'll fix it up a little bit. But it has links to volunteering. And it also has an event calendar that just sort of scrolls down. These are the next upcoming ones, and you can view the calendar that way. And sort of see this calendar view. And then all these, let's say Jamestown Park, this will take you to this event. And then if you're going to register for it, it takes you back here to this. So it's all like going to the same page. And then on each one, there's just an opportunity to sign up. You don't have, if you haven't pre-registered, you can still attend. It just helps the site leader know that you're coming. I know I see these announced occasionally for Alexandria, for those of you there, and you don't have to be from Arlington to come to our events. So, we welcome you. The other thing I'll just sort of point out is that we have this, it's not really obvious, but it says more sign-up groups here. We also do native plant restoration projects. So we have a native plant nursery, we collect seed, we propagate plants, we sort of manage that. And that is almost all year round, usually shuts down in January, February. And then we might have other planting events that are public planting events. So Or like this, for example, this is a plant rescue where we're digging up little trees, little plants, moving them to another part of the park and replanting them in advance of a stream thing. So, and then the tree stewards have a calendar of volunteer events, I know. So that's another place to look.
That calendar isn't the Track It Forward.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay. I guess I had till 9 o'clock, but maybe if this last time, I don't know. I'm not going to just talk to fill time. So,
I have a question actually. How many of you are working on this, Arlington? How much of a workforce do you have for this?
no. So it's myself and then my manager, Alonzo, though he's really these days focused on deer management. And then, and he focuses more on like sort of like all sorts of things related to natural resource management. I am particularly, my position is focused on invasive plant management in addition to other things. And then, but I manage the invasive plant contractors, which is the biggest budget my unit has. So like our unit has a budget of like $15,000-$20,000, and then we have 100 or 200,000 to pay the contractor. So a lot of what I do is managing the contractor. And then we have Sue, who's our natural resource technician, who some of you may have met or will meet. And she does a lot with the native plant nursery and the habitat restoration work. And then she also is licensed to treat invasive. So sometimes where it's something that I like in Noreen's park, I don't have the contractor coming through there yet. It's on my to-do list, but the contract, I just only have resources, so I'm working my way through the list. But like Sue went out and treated some tree of heaven there, or like there was this one really big vine or something like that. So sometimes, or where we're doing planting, try to pre-treat areas so that I had the contractor come through and hit celandine along 4 Mile Run. And to sort of like avoid overspray. So basically it's a 3-person staff is the natural resources. And then I focus a lot on invasives, and Sue spends part of her time on invasive management. And then I have contractors. So that's what I have. Yeah. Any other questions?
Jen, I have not a question because I know the answer to this, but you just touched on with the ailanthus, and could you explain that there are certain kinds of trees that like ailanthus, tree of heaven, that when you cut them down, they're going to generate more babies, and what you do in a situation like that?
Yeah, so tree of heaven in particular, like many trees will stump sprout. I think, many of us have seen where a tree was cut down and we get those little tiny sucker sprouts, water sprouts, stump sprouts, whatever. Not being a tree steward, I don't know what they're officially called. So I'll call them stump sprouts. And some trees, will also, so tree of heaven will do that. The thing about tree of heaven is it will also, all along the root system, everywhere those roots were spread out in the soil, and I'm sure you guys learned about how most of the roots are in the top foot or so of soil, and they spread out up to the drip line, at least of the tree. If tree of heaven is cut down, everywhere that root system is, you get this resprout from those roots. And so you just get this massive, like you might cut down one tree of heaven and then you'll get like everywhere those roots are, you'll get a baby popping up every foot along the root system. So like we cut one down in Alcova, and now we have, well, fortunately it was part of a larger project. We pretty much got rid of it, but it's definitely something where we see that happening. And so that's a lot of times along highways or these groves of tree of heaven where there probably was one and they chopped it and then they got 50, and now they have a little grove of tree of heaven there. And so it's one where we have really found that you have to treat it with herbicide, let the plant die, and then cut it. You can cut it and apply herbicide right away, especially in the fall. But, you know, we just have generally found that it's better to try to kill the tree, let it die, and then cut it down. So we just did that, for example, at Douglas Park in Arlington. There was a little grove of tree of heaven where we treated them. Most of them died. We treated 2 more again just to make sure, and then went and sort of removed them. So yeah, it's definitely something. See if I can find a good image of this. I'm going to share my screen again. So if you see this, like this little cluster right here, there was probably 1 tree of heaven, and then you got this.
We can't see your screen.
Oh, there's 2 steps to sharing. I keep hitting the screen share, and then there's like, you have to say, yes, I really do want to share. So, so here's a case where there's just, again, this little cluster. Probably there was all this back here. This is all probably from the same tree originally. So.
And
What?
explain a good way to identify tree of heaven, the way it smells.
So tree of heaven, it smells to me like, people have said rancid peanut butter. So there's a lot of guides out there. I would say that it also, when it's in flower, it can be pretty distinctive. Let me see if I can find a good picture of tree of heaven. But yeah, it's got this smell. So sumac, it can look like sumac. There's but then when you crush the leaves and you get a smell, it sort of smells like rancid peanut butter. And sumac will have a very distinctive smell, and walnut will have a very distinctive smell, but this has more of that sort of rancid peanut butter smell. And then at a certain time of year, it has these sort of salmon colored flowers that can be sort of orange, pink, salmon colored. And there's a whole ton of it along the highway. So that's definitely a good place to look for it. And then the bark is very distinctive. It kind of looks like cantaloupe, but I would say the smell is a good way to double check your ID. And even as a little seedling, it'll have that smell. So anything else? From anybody? Anybody, you know, like, I think the main thing is, you know, as tree stewards, just to be aware that some of these plants are out there. I'm going to just bring up this tree. This is a plant that kind of has sort of an ailanthus look to it. And we're just starting to sort of find it in the area, and are trying, it behaves kind of like ailanthus. So this is kind of, if you find something that seems like ailanthus, and it's not ailanthus, but it's not sumac, it's not walnut, this is a possibility. It has a very distinctive sort of seed pod, but something we're trying to keep from getting established in this area. So
I have a question. I love to hike, and a friend of mine says she can't hike anymore because everywhere she sees invasives, she just wants to pull them all up. So how do you, I don't know, stay positive? Because you probably notice them all too. I don't know.
So I definitely, you know, when I'm doing invasive training, I'm like, you know, this is, you don't want to know. Like, you're never going to enjoy a walk in the woods again. Everywhere you go, you're going to see these plants. And so if you go to some other part of the country, you don't, you're like, I'm like in Texas, and I'm like, I think that's not supposed to, but I don't know for sure. But I'm trying to enjoy my trip, Big Bend, and I keep looking at this plan. I'm like, oh, I'm not supposed to be here. And eventually I break down and like, or in some park system will have a sign about it or something. So, but I think it is good to overcome that kind of green blindness where you start seeing, like, for me, I think a lot of times if you don't know about this, it's, like walking into a classroom or school or something, and you see all the kids holding books and everything looks fine. And then you realize all the kids are holding their book upside down or something, like not that kids these days have books, but like it's like kind of getting a more educated eye as to what's supposed to be there. How do I stay positive? Well, personally, like pulling invasives can be very therapeutic. It's, some things are kind of picky, but sometimes like you get out there, you really get this stuff up, you can turn around and be like, oh, from there to here, it's better. Like you can make that immediate concrete difference in the world. And just, if you have any frustrations or whatever, you just you're pulling this stuff up, you're outside, you're chatting with people. It can be very sort of, enjoyable. I've seen, all kinds, I've found frogs and, raccoon skulls and seen birds and everything while I'm out there. So it gets me out in the woods, it gets me away from the trail. And it gets you're sort of sitting there. And so you have more chance to notice stuff, as well as you got to look up every now and then and not just be there pulling. I remember being with Nora Palmatier, who I don't know if she's currently the president of the TreeStewards, but has been many times, working at Lacey Woods. And she's like, okay, let's all just stop and look up, and just see the trees there overhead and appreciate the environment around us. The other thing that keeps me positive is that I see progress. Like I definitely see progress in the parks in Arlington. There are parks that they're still invasives, they're still there. There's now there's a bunch of stiltgrass, or now there's a bunch of smartweed or something. But when I try to remember, you couldn't even see into the woods. Like it was all multiflora rose and bush honeysuckle, and half the trees had English ivy on them. And it really is so like they really have progressed. And I've seen that. And like at Gulf Branch, like I was saying, Lacey Lover Run, I see the hillside covered with that's that little white wildflower. Bloodroot. At Gulf Branch, I found rattlesnake fern that I had never seen in the park before, in an area that used to be covered with invasives. And I was like, oh my God, I found what is this? I think it's a rattlesnake fern, and here it is in my park, not just out in some big park out in Fairfax. So I think I see those things. So yeah, like you have to try to remember how much worse it used to be in some areas. And then it's tough because, there's so many stressors out there in the natural environment. And I'm just trying to sort of buy some time for natural systems to be more resilient, to be able to cope with some of these stressors, have more resources to do that, have fewer negative pressures. Because I do think nature is really resilient, and I think we're going to lose around here 20-30% of our native species probably in the next 50 years, which is like just chokes me up to say that. But I think that we have 800 species here or something, and I think that some of them will thrive and be able to come in, and maybe some of the ones that are a little more typical of Southern Virginia can kind of hopefully be there and thrive. So, and in the short run, like I say, you see that positive, like, wow, look, it looks better. So that also keeps me going.
Jen, I would echo that, because I think especially if you work regularly or semi-regularly at a certain site, like you get into a group, an invasives pull group that has regular events on the calendar, you do start to see the improvement. And, you know, I'll see some of the folks here on Thursday because we're doing an invasive class at the Dominion Hill site. And you'll be able to see like all kinds of trees where there's dried vines, you know, hanging off because they used to be just completely smothered, and we cut them and they're drying and falling off now. And we know we're uncovering little black cherry trees that were trying to come up under there, little oak trees. So, you know, you do when you go out regularly or semi-regularly, you do see that improvement bit by bit. It's
Yeah.
worth.
And you know, like you untangle that vine from that little tree, and you feel good, you know. So, and yeah, then eventually you can come back later and see that tree is doing better. So, yeah. All right. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Okay.
All right, shall we call it then?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you guys, and like congratulations on being almost done, you know, with your class. And yeah, there's a lot of, you know, ways to volunteer. There's a lot of different groups doing things with trees, and so yeah, you'll all find something, I'm sure. And if you really can't find anything to do, you can always you know, join us at the nursery or join us for invasive plant removal. So yeah.
Great
Thanks
stuff.
for all you do.
All right, good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Here, thanks.